Well, some other individual might have the idea that X is not the totality of ideas. The masked man has the idea that X is the totality of ideas. So obviously I can deposit this counterexample immediately. It's pretty easy to do it. If you say that X is the totality of ideas, I'm going to say that X is not the totality of ideas. The masked man doesn't want to hear that because the masked man cannot incorporate this idea into the totality of his ideas. This is where it gets a little bit more complicated, right? If I have the idea that X is the totality of ideas, I can immediately show that that is a ridiculous idea to have. How do I do this? By positing the claim that X is not the totality of ideas, right? That itself is an idea. X is not the totality of ideas. I cannot incorporate this idea into my totality of ideas because it undermines my totality of ideas. Also, it shows that I don't have the totality of ideas. Why? Because there's an idea that I cannot incorporate into the totality of the ideas. The only way around this is to suggest that this is not an idea, which is clearly false, right? So this is the perfect counterexample to this, right? If you say that X is the totality of ideas, the counterexample to that argument is to say that, no, X is not the totality of ideas, and this is an idea. This cannot be incorporated into this, which proves that this is false. Why does it prove that this is false? Because there's an idea outside of this totality. Okay. Well, that's a bit technical, right? But the masked man, without maybe rationalizing it that explicitly, to that level of sort of logical analysis, recognizes that my claim is ridiculous, right? My claim is ridiculous. Other people aren't going to buy into what I buy into. Other people aren't going to ascribe to the beliefs that I ascribe to, right? And what I want to do is I want to enforce my beliefs on those other people. It's not that I'm going to try and argue or rationalize or reason with other individuals, but it now becomes the point of me imposing my opinion on the will of others, right? So this is the sort of the precursor, obviously, to violence, is a recognition that I have, or I wish to have, the belief that my ideas are the totality of all ideas. I immediately recognize that that's impossible, right? Because the very idea that I have the capacity for all ideas in my head doesn't take into account this counterexample. People who have that belief, that I don't have all of ideas within my head, are indirectly undermining my perfection, right? Remember, we said that since I have the capacity to have all these ideas in my head, I'm so much better than everybody else, I'm so filled with vanity and pride and hubris. Who are you to challenge my intellectual authority? Well, what ends up happening is, in challenging challenging the intellectual authority of the masked man, I am also challenging the perfection of the masked man, right? And that cannot be accommodated. That will not be acceptable. The masked man views his ideation, his ideas, his ability to reason with a really small r, we'll get to this in a second, as the perfection of ideation, the perfection of reason. Why? Because essentially his reason is dogmatic. He makes an appeal only to himself. There is no appeal beyond the authority of his authority. And as such, there is no need to engage in discourse, right? There is no need to engage in dialogue or any appeals beyond my own authority, because that would mean that someone is equally powerful to me, or maybe even more powerful than I am, and that is not possible for the masked man. Okay, so what ends up happening, right? What ends up happening when I have this view? If this is the sort of foundational account for my interpretation of myself, and more importantly, my interpretation to the relationship between myself and others, then I recognize that every other human being is a potential threat to me, right? This guy becomes a threat, right? He becomes a threat to my perfection. His claim that X is not the totality of ideation is in direct opposition to my claim that X is the totality of opposition. We can't make both of these claims, right? You can't say that it is A and not A at the same time. That it is the totality of ideas and not the totality of ideas at the same time. What you can say is that this is the case or this is the case, and the masked man doesn't want to lose, right? He refuses to lose. So the masked man views all other men, especially men that aren't like him, that aren't mass, as a potential threat. So that this other person becomes THRE18. This other person becomes a threat to the masked man. And what ends up happening is that the masked man, according to Gasset, for this very reason, for this perceived threat from the other, becomes vulgar, right? He becomes barbaric. He sloughs off liberalism and democracy for fascism, for barbarism. And let's see what he says about this idea of vulgarity. Gasset says, with respect to vulgarity, he says, I laid down at the, this is what, in my first chapter, I laid down as the characteristic of our time. Not that the vulgar believes itself super excellent. Not that the vulgar, and obviously by the vulgar now he's talking about the masked man, and I should put as vulgar. The masked man as vulgar, vulgar, right? The masked man as vulgar. What does Gasset say? He says, not that the vulgar believes itself super excellent and not vulgar, but that the vulgar proclaims and imposes the rights of vulgarity, or vulgarity as a right. Vulgarity as a right. I mean, wow. Like, what does that mean? Okay. Gasset is saying, and I think this is an amazing claim to say, right? Vulgarity as a right is dangerous, to say the least. You are a threat to me, precisely because the ideas governing how you behave are in direct contradiction to the ideas governing the way that I behave, right? So that your existence is in direct threat to my existence. Instead of negotiating, instead of trying to engage in discourse, dialogue, discussion with the other, I view the other as a threat. In viewing you as a threat, what I do is I instantiate, I sort of proclaim myself as an equal threat. So now we have a bi-directional threat. You're a threat to me, you're a threat to me, and I'm a threat to you. Because you and your claims are in direct opposition to me and my claims, you are a threat to me. But guess what? I don't support your claims, and my claim is in direct opposition to you. So now we're going to have this back and forth, right? We're going to recognize that the nature of our relationship, myself and the other, the mass and the non-mass, or the other mass, is always going to be antagonistic. When I see you, I immediately think threat, and when you see me, you should be thinking threat as well. This is the nature of the relationship. So that the relationship is fundamentally embodied and defined by its contentious state, by this threat, perceived though it may be, right? What Gasset says that I think is profound is that in recognizing the inability for me to incorporate this antithetical position into my claim for perfection, I immediately sort of elevate vulgarity to a right. I know that I'm not perfect, right? I know that there's a flaw in my theory, and here it is. It's the counterexample. I recognize that there's something I cannot incorporate into my theory of totality, right? There's this anomaly. And what do we do with the anomaly? We exterminate the anomaly, right? Because what I want to do is I want to create, and he says this later in the chapter, and this sort of ties it, this directly ties into what I do for a living, which is sort of genocide research. I want to annihilate heterogeneity, right? I want to annihilate heterogeneity. I want to annihilate diversity. What I want to do is impose homogeneity. I want to impose the right to be vulgar. And that right to be vulgar assumes that anything that does not conform to what I believe in is a threat.